But on top of that, the idea that like, oh, am I only even into this woman because of that awful path that this awful abuser put me on is such a just dark, tragic, sad idea. Hi everyone, today I'd like to talk about Baby Reindeer, one of the best new shows I've seen in quite some time. Mad credit to Netflix for producing this and making this. This is a show created by Richard Gadd. We are going to get into full spoilers. This is for people who have seen the show to kind of wrap their heads around the show and just kind of a post-game discussion. If you haven't seen the show, you might be able to keep up. I'll fill you in on some details, but yeah, we're just gonna go. The show obviously follows the relationship between a victim of stalking and the stalker, and it also deals with the victim's history of abuse. The story really does revolve around Donnie. He is a stand-up comedian who is being stalked by Martha. Similar to A24's Beef from last year, this show is essentially following this pressure cooker between Donnie and Martha. Now, I just want to gush about how good the performances are here. Donnie is great. Richard Gadd, I believe this is his first big acting role. Completely knocks it out of the park. Yes, he's basically playing himself, a fictionalized version of himself, but he does a good job. All his like stand-up comedy scenes are so painfully cringe to watch in the best way possible. And when he really needs to deliver on the kind of like visceral trauma moments or the emotional moments, he absolutely crushes it. These are harrowing scenes to watch, genuinely uncomfortable, and I have to give credit to him to be able to sit in this discomfort and like know that he's unsettling the audience. There's this great little interview he's done where he's talked about the fact that he told his parents not to watch certain episodes, and I totally get why, because it's almost too convincing, especially knowing that most if not all of what we see is what he went through in real life. The fact that he's reliving this on camera is like a lot.
My parents haven't seen the show already, and I've warned them against certain episodes.
It is also important to know that this is based on a live stand-up comedy show that Richard used to tour.
Reindeer is an autobiographical play. It's a theatre piece that I've written about the last 10 years of my life. The basic story is that I offered a stranger a cup of tea, and how that one act of kindness evolved into almost a decade of relentless stalking and harassment. It's a very dark show, it's a very personal show, it's a show I find very hard to do, but it's going to the West End. I couldn't be happier.
Next, I want to gush about Martha. What a multifaceted, complex character. The absolute highlight of this show for me is Martha. It is almost too uncomfortable to watch. It is that good of a performance. Every time I see her, she reminds me of people I've met before, where it's this awful combination of like, you unsettle me, but I do feel bad. And I think the fact that this show is basically built off that premise, the fact that Donnie, the main character, knows that he shouldn't be getting involved with this woman, knows that it's bad, knows that there's going to be consequences, but he just can't help but pity her. I think having that in a monologue really helps us as an audience understand why Donnie is making seemingly irrational decisions. The next performance I want to mention is Terry. I thought Terry was fantastic. What a great, well-realized character, and really adds a lot of dynamic to the core conflict. I absolutely loved the pacing of the first two episodes. I do believe that the pacing is at its best in those first two episodes. For the first two episodes, it reminds me honestly of the tonality of like a Fleabag, all right? This kind of like darkly comic, nihilistic, mean-spirited humor, but you kind of are still endeared to these characters. It's a really funny, dark, twisted story about stalking.
Say this woman's stalking you?
Yeah, like 6 months maybe.
Why'd it take you so long to report it?
I think she needs help. She comes to my work, my house. She sends me emails like all the time.
Are any threatening towards you?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's particularly threatening.
There's enough darkness and danger for it to feel compelling, for it to feel like this little true crime thing you're getting a glimpse into. Those first two episodes genuinely feel like a perfect dark comedy premise. Around the end of episode 2, the start of episode 3, however, things start to shift. There is a scene where Martha gropes Donnie, and his reaction there genuinely feels like the product of trauma. Now, yes, an unwanted sexual advance from Martha is enough to be uncomfortable on its own, but you very much get a sense from the way it's framed, the way it's delivered, that it is unlocking some core memories for him. It is taking him back to a darker time in his life. We also have this foreshadowed because Martha throughout the show says, "Oh, I feel like something happened to you. I feel like someone hurt you when you were younger." Even though these first two episodes are noticeably lighter, you still have this kind of idea that something is coming. But I think the reason everyone is talking about this show is just how hard it commits to the darkness in episode 4. Episode 4 opens with the pitch of, why haven't I reported her sooner? Why did I wait 6 months to report this psycho who's stalking me and ruining my life. Episode 4 is basically a 45-minute short movie detailing a series of abusive incidents that happened to Donnie from a stand-up comedy TV producer. We watch Donnie basically get groomed and promised the life of his dreams by this producer who drugs him and takes advantage of him in several situations.
So during Baby Reindeer, there's the flashback episode where we actually go back in time to Donnie going to the Edinburgh Fringe, meeting someone in the industry who takes him under their wing, helps them in their career, but goes on to abuse Donnie.
Fucking hell, that's disgusting. Little pain for a little gain.
And that's obviously taken from my real life experiences.
The way this episode is handled is an absolute masterwork. I do just want to say, genuinely one of the most intense episodes of television I think I've ever seen. Again, this doesn't feel like just a straight to Netflix, dumped on Netflix original. This feels like it has passion and vision and like a brave voice behind it. This is a lot. This episode is a lot, and Donnie's inner monologue really helps to flesh it out. The moment you're sitting there going, dude, go home. Why are you going back? He's asking himself the same question. I think the section that made me realize just how good this show was the section in the back end where it basically details the aftermath of the abuse, the way his brain started shifting. This section started dealing with ideas that I thought were genuinely brave, uncomfortable, and really don't have easy answers. And I was shocked to see that Netflix, as a mainstream media company, were brave enough to actually let this show be as unfiltered as it is. Because the questions Donnie starts asking himself after his abuse are genuinely troubling and leave you with a lot of questions. The specific examples I mean here are these moments where Donnie is questioning whether his sexual preferences, his sexual orientation as a whole is changed due to the abuse he suffered at the hands of that grooming producer. He starts engaging in adult content that is reflective of the trauma he experienced.
I could never tell whether these feelings were because of him or whether they always existed deep down. Like, did it all happen because I was giving off some vibe I wasn't aware of? Or did what happened make me this way? I orgasmed quickly, in such a way that there was no denying my desires were shifting. Every day the laptop called me to it. I felt confused. I felt angry. I felt like I was going through puberty all over again.
He says his sexual orientation is changing. He starts looking to date men. He starts seeing himself as a bisexual. He starts actively looking to date a trans woman. These are ideas that if the wrong person watched this show, if an ignorant person watched this show, would have a completely awful takeaway from. But I guess as a mature audience member, you're sitting there watching that going like, oh my God, like this was his experience. This is what he experienced. What do we do with that as an audience? Like this is a lot. And specifically the moment where he's sitting across from Terry, this trans woman that he's in love with, and he says to the audience, am I only in this position? Am I only in love with her? Am I only across the table from this beautiful woman that I care so much about because of what that guy did to me? That is an incredibly powerful thought to leave it on.
But with every handhold or lingering stare came a crushing sense of anger and shame that I was falling in love with her, that I couldn't hide in anonymity anymore. Perhaps most bitter of all, that I might not feel this way if he hadn't done what he did.
There's no easy answer there. And that's what I love most about this show. It presents these awful ideas, these horrible thoughts that Donnie is experiencing, but based on what you've seen and based on what you know, you understand why he thinks that, and you get the line of thinking as the audience, this absolute mindfuck of, oh, I can't connect with this woman across from me because of inbuilt transphobia. But on top of that, the idea that like, oh, am I only even into this woman because of that awful path that this awful abuser put me on, is such a just dark, tragic, sad idea. It's what makes Terry so interesting as a character, because she's not wrong later in the season when they're having libido issues, sexual mismatch issues, the fact that he can't get it up for her. She's not wrong for being insulted and assuming it's transphobia, and to an extent, it actually is that, but he has a pretty good explanation for it. She's not in the wrong for thinking that it's transphobia. There is definitely aspects of that there built in. However, she doesn't know the true reason for that. The way she handles that situation is totally valid, but also the way he's handling his situation is totally valid. And it's like, does he need to communicate to her at that point what he's been through so they're on a mutual understanding level? We can't blame him for not. It's such a horrific thing that he's been through. And it's what makes this show so interesting. That conflict is so fascinating to watch unfold. She's totally justified for being hurt, and totally fair enough that she thinks it validates a bunch of insecurities she has existing as a trans woman. However, he's totally valid for being sexually traumatized and not being able to get it up for her. And he's also completely fair enough for not opening up to her in that moment about about just how horrific the abuse he's been through has been. Donnie isn't perfect, Donnie isn't innocent, and Donnie isn't like a great guy. There's this whole bit where Terry confronts him. You're enabling this crazy lady's behavior, like you haven't been to the police. Why? And he says, oh, they didn't take it seriously. And she goes, well, they would have taken it seriously if you reported the fact that I was attacked in a bashing. And she goes, did you even do that? And he says, yes. And she goes, no, you didn't, because if you did that, police would have interviewed me. She calls him out on his bullshit. It's such an awful thing of him to do at that point, to lie to her and say that he did actually report the hate crime, because he didn't. Like, he didn't. He can't even confront how weak he's been in that moment. And that's a lot of what Donnie's character arc is. He says it in his little on-stage breakdown that goes viral, where he talks about the fact that he hates himself, and he hates himself more than he can love people. And that's the most frustrating moments with Donnie as a character. It's not when he enables Martha to stalk him. Honestly, the whole stalking thing, up until a point, I was just like, I get it. You like validation. You wanted to be famous, and she's giving you that in an isolated pocket. Like, I got that. Up until it turned into a transphobic attack on Terry. Up until it turned into her threatening the ex-girlfriend. Up until it turned into the ex-girlfriend's mother feeling uncomfortable. Up until his parents were being threatened. And he's still sitting there half cocking it. The fact that his reaction to the Diet Coke being thrown on the ex-girlfriend, by the way, it definitely was Diet Coke, but the fact that his reaction wasn't, oh my God, I'm going to go to the police immediately, we're going to see what we can do. And instead, his response was, oh, it's just Diet Coke. It's like, no, these people are having very normal responses. And even though you're traumatized, even though we as an audience understand what you've been through and why you have this complicated relationship with reporting her, it's not good enough that you expect other people to fall in line to that broken line of thinking. While we're on that topic, that was the most amazing moment of this season, was basically episode 4, the way it starts, where he says, oh, here's why I didn't report her for 6 months. You get this detailed history of how this awful man abused him, and then it cuts back to the present and goes, there's no way I felt comfortable reporting Martha when I never reported the initial guy that groomed and abused me. Totally powerful, total profound, totally worked on me. Like a great, great episode of television. He can't make people fall into that line of thinking. We understand why, and maybe if he actually explained it to them, they would get it. But it's like, dude, even if you're not going to report her for you, you need to look out for the people around you. And that's the thing. He hates himself, so he can't do that for other people. I understand it. This isn't a criticism of the show. It's just what makes the whole Martha-Donnie situation so fascinating. While we're on the topic of Martha, I do kind of feel bad for her. Even at the end of the show, I feel a bit bad for her, which is bad. She's assaulted and harassed Donnie multiple times. She assaulted Terry. She's obviously nuts. She's off her rocker. But there is this cause and effect that this show invites you to think about.
I'm brutally honest with myself in the show as well. Like, there's a lot I didn't do right. You know, it's not just a victim narrative. I think it would have been easy for me to do this show and sort of be like, oh, I offered a cup of tea to a stranger, aren't I wonderful? And then, oh my God, I ruined my life. But no, I made a lot of mistakes on the way, and I didn't behave appropriately in a number of scenarios, which made the situation worse. I think initially I indulged in the attention, which of course, if somebody is a renowned sort of stalker and harasser, that's going to make everything worse. So it's also kind of challenges myself within the narrative and holds my hands up to the mistakes I made as well. So it's a very honest, very, I think, very intense experience.
Donnie admits throughout the show multiple times that he led her on. He did instigate some of this. He should have left here. He shouldn't have done this. He shouldn't have done that. And it's really fascinating, especially on rewatch, to sit there and go, could this have ended any other way? Could he have cut it off here properly? Could he have cut it off here? Because all his cut-off attempts were a bit strange. They were cut off and then they were kind of like, oh, but here's a little glimmer of hope. As he says to the camera, he does enjoy the attention. But I think that's another aspect of what makes this show so brave. I was talking earlier about the fact that I found all those questions of like sexuality and the cause and effect of his sexuality really confronting and really fascinating. I also found the idea that he was enabling certain abuse also really interesting. It feels like a really brave thing for Netflix to be platforming, because oftentimes we talk about the fact that you should never blame the victim. So to have someone like Donnie, who is very clearly a victim, sitting there and throwing himself through the ringer and questioning all these things and being like, did I initiate this? Why did I go back to this person's house? Why did I keep doing this? I knew this was going to happen and I kept doing it. I think it adds a level of humanity and like real raw human experience that oftentimes media is too scared to actually confront.
I think part of the reason the show works is because it is controversial. I think if I just did a show and I trimmed off the controversies and just made it a stalking narrative and just woe is me, then it wouldn't be as impactful, because I think people forget that we are human and we do make mistakes. And I think that's what makes the show successful, that honesty.
I know people in my real life who have been through these situations who ask themselves the same questions, and oftentimes they feel like they can't even say that. They feel like they can't sit there and go, I should have known better, and I'm angry at myself for getting involved in that. Now, I'm not sitting here blaming victims. That's not why I'm giving praise to the show. However, I'm just saying it's really refreshing to see a show that doesn't hold your hand through the morality of someone's inner thoughts. You are meant to sit there and unpack it and digest it, and they're seriously confronting thoughts to engage in.
I don't know. Like, bi, maybe.
And what makes you bi?
Because I feel like a fraud no matter who I sleep with.
I just admire how far this show is willing to go. This feels like Netflix has a Fleabag on its hands. This great little like flash in the pan moment from an up and coming comedian that is clearly funny, but also deeply dark and sad and personal. And I love that both shows have these really complicated relationships with sexuality and like traumatic experiences. To add a bit of levity, can we just talk about Donnie's stand-up comedy?
Yeah, the stand-up in the early years was terrible.
You're shite!
I think what I was trying to do was do a weird brand of comedy, a sort of anti-comedy, like a subversive style, to audiences that just weren't interested in that. They just wanted to hear some jokes.
So my mum died today.
Now, he admits in an interview that I watched that his stand-up comedy used to be awful. It is rough. There is a lot of dark content in this show, like full-on dark content, and nothing made me squirm more than like some of these scenes of him trying to get a laugh from people. I guess the hard thing while watching this show is it's autobiographical, right? Like, so I have to assume that some of this material he's using was his real-life material, and it is rough to watch. It is bad, it is painful, and it's like I want to like him as a character. I want to be rooting for him. I want to be like, oh yes, this career you're pursuing that has led to all this violent, horrific, awful abuse at least was like worthy of chasing. But can I just say, fucking hell, that stand-up comedy was rough. That was a rough, tough watch. A really interesting thing to think about with all of this, and I'm actually surprised it wasn't explored given just how dark some of Donnie's thought experiments throughout this show were, is the fact that he only had his big break by retelling his trauma. He didn't achieve his big break from this goofy prop-based comedy hacky material. He achieved it through this moment of like a mental breakdown or a mental breakthrough, sitting on stage basically just going through his brain and his trauma. I was actually surprised to see that Donnie as a character didn't really have any pause and reflect on this moment and go, oh, I achieved my dreams, but here's what it cost. That makes me feel worse or better or whatever. I actually would have loved to hear Donnie's thoughts on that. The fact that the only thing the audience responded to was his trauma and his pain. I think that would have been really interesting and would have added some really interesting metatextual stuff, right? Because this show is an adaptation of his stage show, which was an adaptation of his true life story. And now he's having his big break on Netflix. I just feel like it could have been a really interesting moment for him to acknowledge the audience directly and be like, is there a fascination with dark content and trauma? Again, my big takeaway from this show is this bravery in its exploration of like sexual trauma. You know, these situations of his sex drive not working, so then he starts beating off to photos of Martha, like absolutely insane, dark, twisted territory. These ideas that his sexual orientation and preferences are being completely rewired by a horrific experience are things that I think actually happen very often, but people are too scared to talk about. And it genuinely feels brave and profound to be putting on a TV show. I've seen a lot of people talk about the fact that like, oh, it's so good to see men's stories be told. It's so good to see a story about men's mental health and men's victimhood be talked about. I think that's a bit reductive. Is it good that men are also able to talk about their horrific experiences and their feelings and emotions? Absolutely. But I think it's a bit sad to not look at this as just a very human experience. Yes, it is something that a man went through. It is a story about a man and masculinity at its core, but I think plenty of female victims or just females in general are going to find a lot to relate in this show. Basically, I'm just saying I hope men don't start gatekeeping this very powerful show about trauma. Honestly, this reminded me of the book A Little Life if it was just a bit better handled. Now, I do have some very, very minor criticism just as a show. This might be how it went in real life. This might be the true story. But as a show, in terms of just like satisfying wrap up, I did find the last 2 episodes just dropped off a bit for me. And the reason for that is essentially these character revelations we have in the last episode or 2 are character revelations that we've had from the jump. The idea that him and Martha are very similar is an idea that characters have talked about from the jump very early on, and it's painfully obvious to the audience. I just felt like that little stinger at the end where he ends up in the bar alone and gets offered a drink for free was a bit on the nose. I know he's not going to go off and like start stalking this guy that like gave him a drink. I get that it's this thing of like, oh my God, I'm in the exact same spot that Martha was. Funny how I'm relating with my abuser. Like, I understand it. I just think it could have communicated better. And honestly, I think it was way more powerful to have him sitting there after sending her off to prison, listening to her words of affirmation in his headphones. And you know what would have been like a really interesting ending? Yes, maybe it didn't happen in real life, but if he actually started like looking at her when she got released from prison, maybe he shows up to the jail once or twice and like sees if he can get a look at her. Like this idea that he actually misses her to that extent that he almost like looks at her from afar, because it's like, we can't be in a relationship together because we torture each other, but I'll look from afar. That I wouldn't have minded. Just this idea that occasionally he checks up on her. He looks at the bus stop, he walks down her street, and occasionally weirdly hopes that he catches a glimpse of her just to know she's okay, even though they can't be in each other's lives because they drive each other fucking nuts. I just thought the hand-holdy like, oh my God, I've become Martha at the end was a bit on the nose given how subtle some of the show's storytelling has been up until that point. But yeah, I thought this show was great. I could talk about it for like an hour and a half. If you enjoyed this video, I'm actually happy to do a follow-up. Please like open up the comment section. I will reply. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.